Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Well, if you are in Europe, good morning, Steve. Good evening if you are in Asia. My name is Gonçalo Santos. I'm an anthropologist based at the University of Coimbra in Portugal. And I will be co-hosting this virtual seminar together with my colleague, Loretta Lowe, based at the London School of Economics. We are both members of a research network, an online platform called Sci-Tech Asia, hence the title of this virtual seminar, Sci-Tech Asia Virtual Seminar Series. And this network really is the collective force behind the initiative. I know that you are all impatient to hear our distinguished speaker. And but before moving on to the distinguished speaker, I'd just like to say something very briefly about this, about the network. You can check our website actually at scitechasia.org. It's really a network of scholars that was established in 2017 by a small group of anthropologists and STS scholars working on Asia. What brought this together really was the conviction that everyday lives in Asia and really around the world were increasingly shaped by developments in science and technology, and that it was important to develop or promote approaches to these intermediations from the critical perspectives of the humanities and social sciences. Of course, the field of STS, and I suppose that many of you in the audience will be familiar with the field of STS, science and technology studies, has been really playing or has played a pioneering role in promoting such critical approaches. But we felt that much of the research within the field of STS was too centered on developments in North America and in Europe. I mean, of course, we are hardly the first to make this point. There's a growing group of Asian scholars around the world working on topics at the intersection of science, technology, and society. And in a way, this virtual seminar, we see it as an opportunity to showcase some of this cutting edge research that is being done in different parts of the world. For us, members of Sci-Tech Asia, is also an opportunity to get together in a world undergoing an unprecedented pandemic. So we no longer can get together in events like the American Anthropological Association. We were supposed to meet this year for the AAA, the Anthropological Association annual meeting, but it was canceled. So of course, this organizing a virtual seminar give us an opportunity to recreate a sense of community and perhaps to get to know many other people, like-minded people in different parts of the world. Before I hand over the floor to my colleague Loretta to introduce Steve, I'd just like to remind you a few basic guidelines of conduct for this seminar. Community requires common rules, and the talk will last for approximately 45 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A session of 30 minutes. When the Q&A session will start, your chat box function will be activated. So you will be able to express your desire to ask a question to the speaker, or perhaps even write the question directly into the chat box function. The talk will end at around 4:15. I would like to remind everyone as well that the talk is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook, on the Sci-Tech Asia Facebook page. Thank you very much. Loretta, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, for people in Europe, and good evening in Asia, and good morning for people in the States. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Stevan Harrell, our inaugural speaker for the Sci-Tech Asia virtual seminar. Stevan Harrell is an ethnographer and interdisciplinary environmental scholar specializing in Taiwan and China. He retired in 2017 after 43 years at the University of Washington in Seattle, where he is now Professor Emeritus of Anthropology and of Environmental and Forest Sciences. Since his retirement, he has been writing about the ecological history of the People's Republic of China, as well as working for sensible climate change mitigation and adaptation policies in Whatcom County in Washington State. A new co-edited collection, Greening East Asia, The Rise of the Eco-Developmental State, has just been published by the University of Washington Press this month. So without further ado, please welcome our speaker, Stevan Harrell.
Thank you, everyone. I see that there is a extremely distinguished audience for this talk, and I am flattered and a little bit nervous. This is the earliest lecture I've ever given, 7 a.m. I gave one at 8 a.m. last year in Guangxi, which was interesting. And but I want to start out by thanking the co-hosts, Loretta and Gonzalo, for organizing this. And I guess this is the first one, but I hope it's not the only one, because I would love to be in the role of listener. And I also want to thank Bruno Coelho and Simona Lengal in Coimbra for organizing all the technical details of this very complex thing. So I want to first briefly contextualize the material that I'll be talking about today. As Loretta said in the introduction, I'm working on a book tentatively called Intensification and Its Discontents, which has to do with the process of intensification of agriculture and industry in the People's Republic since 1949, and the effects that it's had on the environment, using basically concepts from resilience as ecology and systems ecology to understand the changes that have happened and the effects on the general system. It's not really as pessimistic a book as most books on the environment tend to be. There are good things and bad things that have happened. We can't predict the future, and we can't even predict the future of the book. But anyway, this chapter, which I'm talking about today, is based on a chapter on ideology. In other words, what are the ideological drivers of the various kinds of moves that the PRC government, the CCP government, has made over the past 70 years that have resulted in these enormous changes to the physical environment and to the relationship between people and the social system and the ecological system. So this chapter is kind of an ideological prelude to the real nitty-gritty, to the real material of the book, which is about rivers and lakes and buildings and freeways and pollution and pikas and extinctions and revivals and environmentalists. So I wanted to begin by thinking about CCP ideology of progress in general, because I think that often in, often in thinking about the PRC, we tend to periodize history and say, oh, well, we had this revolutionary government, and then something happened after Mao Zedong died, and it became a developmentalist government. But in fact, if we really think about it, we think about there are actually three pillars of the CCP ideology of progress, and they all relate to each other and they all influence each other. And I put development at the apex of this triangle, partly because I think, I will explain in a minute, I think it's fundamental to the other two, but also because Deng Xiaoping in 1992, when he made his Nanxuan, he made this famous pronouncement, 发展才是硬道理. And I'm thinking about this talk, actually, I started to think, you know, I understand what he means. What he means is that That's what it's all about. If we're communists, if we're capitalists, if we're libertarians, if we're any kind of other ideology, since the really beginning of the 20th century or the middle of the 19th, it's all been about development. So today I want to go quickly through development and revolution as two of the three pillars, and then spend a lot more time on science, because this is, after all, Asia's Sci-Tech seminar. And also science is, in a sense, it's the most contentious, it's the most difficult to think about of all of these pillars of the ideology of progress. So development, we'll start with development. Oh, it's not. If we start with development, we think about it in the post-war world, in the post-World War II world, there are really two different ways of thinking about development. One is the capitalist idea of development, of course, which was put forth by the US and to a lesser extent by European countries, and probably summed up the most famously in Walt Rostov's work in the 1940s and 1950s. And the other model is the communist model or the critical model. But the important thing is that, and Sigrid Schmalzer has said this in her wonderful book, Red Revolution, Green Revolution, the parallels between Leninism, and which I've called the critical model here, and US modernization theory, which I've called the Rostovian model, the parallels between Leninism and US modernization theory are clear. Both were committed to modernization through technological development, and both depended on deterministic expectations that development would proceed through specific stages. And so while we had this post-war world, and I'm one of the older people here in the audience, but we remember capitalism, communism, the free world, the communist bloc, or if you look at it from the other side, the colonial powers, the core countries, the first world, the global north. These two, of course, were thought of each other as mortal enemies, as people who had fundamentally different outlooks on and fundamentally different goals for how the world would look in a few decades or in a few centuries. But in fact, the goal was the same. The red star for the critical model, which included the Leninists, and the blue star for the Rostovian model or the capitalist model. They were the same star. They were simply a different color. And if you look at the Rostovian model, you think about it, the developing countries, you divide the world into the developed countries and the developing countries. Words that I would never use on my own, only use to quote other people. Because the assumption here is that there's a single track along which development proceeds. And development, of course, is the enrichment, material enrichment. And it proceeds along a single track. It's just that some countries are ahead of others. So the United States, Western Europe, Japan are ahead of everybody else, but Africa, Asia, Latin America, to use a familiar term, they're behind, but they will catch up. It's just two trains running on the same track, one behind the other and ending up at the same station. But if you look at the critical model, and it could be a Leninist model, or it could be something like the critiques of development, people like Arturo Escobar write about. There's a problem here. Yes, the world is divided into wealthier countries and less wealthy countries. But the reason it's divided is because through historical processes, beginning as early as the age of exploration, the colonial powers keep the colonized territories poor by means of exploitation. Or you think of Wallersteinian world systems theory, same thing. They keep the colonized territories poor, and they're not going to catch up. That train, it can't leave the station until the tracks are cleared. And the tracks only are going to get cleared by some kind of process of revolution, some kind of overturning of the power relationships between the people on top and the people on the bottom. And after revolution happens, then in fact, development can proceed. So I think it's really important to remember that even though these two saw each other as mortal enemies, they were pursuing more or less the same goal. That is to say, a wealthy, a materially wealthy world. So next pillar is revolution, because within this context, CCP and other communist governments and some non-communist leftist governments saw that since the tracks had to be cleared before the train could run. And in the CCP version of this, of course, we have to think about the dialectical materialism and the Marxist-Leninist dialectical teleology of history. In other words, we have to think seriously about the material in dialectical materialism to understand not so much the revolutionary goal of development, but we have to understand this to understand the nature of the material nature and how it affects the environment. So if you go back and thinking about Marxist teleological history, you think about material history as a progression of modes of production. And the most important thing about this is to think about what Marx and Engels meant by material, because they didn't necessarily mean the natural environment. What they meant more than anything else was the relationship, was the relations of production. And if you think about what does revolution do for progress, for development? Well, what it does is it frees the productive forces. And what are the productive forces? Well, land, labor, and capital, but more than anything else, labor, because labor can only serve the desired needs if it's not under the constraint of exploitation, whether it's by feudal ruling classes or capitalist market system. And so when most Marxists in the Soviet Union and in the PRC, not all, but most, talked about materialism, they meant the relationship between labor and the things that, and capital and other goods. They weren't talking so much about the ecosystems, the land, the water, the air, as aspects of this materiality. So it's a human-centered materiality. And the result of this is that the general feeling that ecosystems are no constraint on development. And if we think of this in the context of the PRC, of course, the most famous slogan of this, I should have written it down, but "Renyo do da chan, Renyo do da dan, dio do da chan." If people have enough courage, then the environment will produce greatly. In other words, ecosystems, the material world or the natural world as we think of it, is no constraint on development. The only constraint is the particular organization of the means of production within a particular mode of production. So revolution liberates the productive forces and promotes development, which is the ultimate goal. And there is a very interesting, in addition to the general idea that we don't need to worry about ecosystems, we just have to worry about how to use the resources within them. One version of this is that environmental degradation is a capitalist problem. And for example, in the 1950s and in the 1960s, Remy Ribal would occasionally talk about this, and they would talk about the fact that, well, whereas in capitalist countries, of course, the goal of capitalists is to enrich the capitalists, it's all about greed, and so they pay no attention to natural resources or to the environment. But here in a socialist country, the goal is the well-being of the people in general. And so we don't waste anything, we don't pollute anything, we don't trash anything. And as sort of odd that it seems to us, this was one of the ideological principles under which development proceeded, and under which development proceeded in the ignorance of ecological or ecosystem constraints. So, excuse me. So revolution in the early years of the People's Republic, at least, led to a kind of materialist approach to the environment, which was to basically leave the environment out. So here's the third pillar, of course, is science, which is the main focus of today's talk. Now we can think back, of course, to Karl Marx, who contended that he had discovered the scientific approach to society, which was parallel to the scientific approach to nature. There's a legend that Marx wrote to Charles Darwin to ask him for permission to dedicate the second volume of Das Kapital to Darwin. This has actually been debunked by historians. He didn't. Marx did write a short note to Darwin at one point, but they did not know each other, and Darwin was not particularly enthusiastic about Marxism. Anyway, going on from Marx, Engels wrote an essay in around 1880 called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, and where he talked about science in the sense that, of course, Marxism was already materialism, but materialism had to be divorced from the metaphysics of such people as Isaac Newton and Carl Linnaeus, and combined with the dialectical approach of Hegel. And if you put materialism, of course, together with Hegel, what we would say, well, this adds up to Marxism. But what Engels was saying in that essay is this adds up to true science. And as the Marxist governments, Marxist-Leninist governments began to take over countries, particularly, of course, Russia and the others that combined into the Soviet Union, Soviet science was in many ways was very advanced, but mainly it was advanced when it forgot its Marxist basis in the dialectical approach of Hegel and just went to doing empirical science. And so we can see the contrast between, for example, Soviet rocket science, which was a little bit better than the Americans that freaked us all out in 1957. And on the other hand, Lysenko biology, which has set Soviet agricultural and biological science back a whole lot. So what about, how did this work itself out in China? What did Mao say about science? In 1940, Mao gave a talk to the Natural Research Society of the Border Region. This is not a well-known talk among all of Mao's talks, but he made this explicit parallel between natural science and social science. Natural science is one of humanity's weapons in its fight for freedom. In order to achieve freedom in society, we must use social science to understand society, to reshape society, and to carry out the social revolution. In order to achieve freedom in the world of nature, one must use natural science to understand nature, overcome nature, and reshape nature. You see quotations of this sort, you see two things. One thing, of course, is that natural science and social science are parallel. And the other thing is that we're using these, both of these in the service of revolution. Now, in one of his most famous and very obscure, or let's say not obscure, obtuse philosophical essays, Mao said, one's knowledge depends mainly on one's activity in material production, through which one gradually understands natural phenomena, natural properties, natural laws, and the relationships between humans and nature. In other words, this is the Marxist idea of practice or praxis applied to the scientific process. And then in 1963, he said, where does people's correct thinking come from? Does it drop from the sky? No. Is it innate in the brain? No. It comes from social practice. It can only come from these three kinds of social practice: the struggle for production, the class struggle, and, most important for us here, scientific experiment. So what did this Maoist approach to science really mean? And I've gotten a lot of enlightenment from this wonderful book by anthropologist Roberto Gonzalez, who's at San Jose State, called Zapotec Science. And it's based on long-term fieldwork in the Sierra in Oaxaca. But he's thinking about how science and scientists have viewed the intricate and complex knowledge systems of peoples in different parts of the world, and how those people's ways of seeing and approaching the world might fit into something that we call science. And he came up with a typology of a whole series of different ways that the term science is used. And I think that when we look at these different ways of seeing how science is used just in this more general typology, we can understand better how the term 科学 actually gets used in Chinese science and in Chinese government policy. So we have science as a collection of certain truths that have been verified. In other words, science tells us that there are 92 natural elements in a periodic table, and they have different numbers of electrons, protons, and neutrons, and so forth. Science is high technology, something that we don't understand, but includes, took a lot of math to put together and works in a very complex way. Science as a social enterprise, that is to say, the world of science. Science as what scientists do. Science is a form of inquiry that makes use of a particular method. Now, that's what you're taught, right? When you go to your beginning science class in middle school or in high school, science is a method. Science is not a body of knowledge, but in fact, it's used for both. And then finally, and this I think applies very closely to some of the things going on at PRC, science as the achievement of, quote, superior Western man. So, if we think about the way that science is talked about in a PRC, and the fact that science means all of these different things, some at one time, one at another, we end up with certain contradictions. The first contradiction is that, in particular in agricultural science and in the application of science to the increasing agricultural production, which of course is the most important part of development in a PRC, there's a contradiction between science as a form of inquiry that makes use of a particular method. Now, everyone is a science. When we look back to this quotation from Mao that I just talked about, class struggle, struggle for production, and scientific experiment. Everyone does science. Peasants do science when they try out different crops, different irrigation regimes, different methods of cultivation. Workers do science in the factory. They experiment and they come up with better and more economical ways to produce copper wire or whatever it is. This contradicts with science as a collection of certain truths that have been verified. That is to say, the things that scientists have done in the laboratories or in their very carefully controlled experiments actually end up getting imposed on workers, getting imposed on peasants in ways that workers and peasants, although we give lip service to their ingenuity and their ability to use the scientific method, in fact, they don't have any choice. They end up using the scientific so-called truths that have been verified. And a second contradiction is this whole idea of 图样结合. 图样结合 was an approach that CCP took to science and the application of science in general. Because 图 represents, of course, the local, not necessarily literally 图 or peasant, but local Chinese, non-professional. And yang represents the kind of science that's done in classrooms and laboratories that is implicitly and explicitly, in the term yang, imported from the West. And because of its populist approach to so many problems, Mao and the mass line and so forth, and from the masses to the masses, tu Kexue becomes a kind of a political check on Yang Kexue, because Yang Kexue is suspect, and it's suspect not only because it's foreign, Yang, but also because it's bourgeois. And so Mao was, on the one hand, very respectful of what Yang Kexue could do, and on the other hand, very suspicious of what the Yang Kexue Jia might do because of their wrong class background. So the application of science to development in the PRC runs into these contradictions. A third one, which is related to the second one, has to do with the relationship between revolutionary praxis and the bourgeoisie. In other words, if science is a social enterprise, and we see very clearly in Mao's statements and otherwise that science, in order to be useful, in order to be allowed, can't be pure science in our sense, has to be applied science. It has to be done in service of the revolution. But at the same time, so many of the scientists who were doing this wonderful stuff were either trained in the West or certainly trained by people who were trained in the West, and trained not just in the West, but in as a sort of capitalist frame of work, capitalist context. So when Mao and CCP ideology, editorials, and so forth, when they talk about science, they run into this series of contradictions, which means that the ideological basis of science as in service of revolution, in service of development, ends up coming into a lot of context, a lot of contradictions. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the institutional context in which this all happened, the contradictions between ideological goals and bureaucratic structures. Of course, as we know, bureaucracy impedes the dialectical process. Therefore, Mao started the Cultural Revolution. But in ecosystem terms, bureaucracy, of course, leads to rigidity, and it leads to what Fritz Holling, not Fritz Hollings, Buzz Holling, and Gary Meffley call pathologies of resource management, in a sense that if you use science, if you think about science as a collection of truths, bureaucracies are very good at imposing programs, imposing behavior on people that derive from the way they see a collection of truths. And so bureaucracy leads to using a framework developed, say, in a laboratory, or developed in one particular part of the country, or developed in one kind of an environment, and imposing this framework on another environment or another part of the country, or a field situation that may not fit with what happened in the laboratory. Another thing that happens with bureaucracy, and this comes from Elinor Ostrom, is it leads to panacea solutions. You need to, if something works in one place, of course, that's what works. And so it will work in another place. And in my work on the Great Leap Forward, which is another chapter of this book, I talk a lot about how something worked in the laboratory or something worked in theory, and the bureaucracy ended up imposing it on local communities, of course, with tragic effects. And so as I said, Mao, of course, recognized that bureaucracy leads to rigidity and leads to stratification. And so this is one reason, not just in the environmental realm or the realm of physical economic development, material development, but also in other realms. The regime went back and forth between a more populist mode, what Skinner and Winkler called a normative phase, and and other people have called a campaign mode. And at this point, the science dialectic between Tu and Yang, the favorite Tu, but when the bureaucracy reasserted itself, of course, then the science itself favored the Yang Kexue. So how does this allow us to think about PRC history? And the reason I started this whole book, I probably should digress here for just a minute. The reason I started this whole book was because there was a conference at UC San Diego in 2007 about new approaches to Chinese recent history. And I proposed periodizing history, not according to campaigns, as it's the conventional historiography always did it, but according to environmental or ecological changes. And so if we look at this diagram that I have here, on the left is the conventional periodization, right? We have the Maoist period of high socialism, and we have socialist construction and the Great Leap Forward, a retreat and a moderate interlude, and then of course the Cultural Revolution, which is the center of all this. And because the Cultural Revolution led to such disasters, when Mao died, Deng Xiaoping found an opening and he started a Gaiga Kaifang. And since then, we were in this process of development. It lasted until around 2012 when Xi Jinping came in and started to impose a kind of new authoritarianism. Well, this has very little to do, at least in some of its phases, it has very little to do with what happened with the environment. And if we look at environmental or ecological history rather than political history, we run into a really very different periodization. Socialist construction on the Soviet model favoring Yang science and so forth, that's common to the two models. But then, of course, the Great Leap Forward changes everything. The Great Leap Forward becomes an ecosystem collapse. Short term, fortunately, but unfortunately very disastrous. And I'm not going to argue whether it was 20 million or 45 million people who starved to death, but the ecosystem was fundamentally collapsed. Agricultural production collapsed, eventually industrial production collapsed, environmental management collapsed. But the system as a whole seemed to have been remarkably resilient because by the 1960s, things were back on track again, and we're back on the kind of what I call environmentally unconscious developmentalism, which relates back to the materialist ideas that I talked about a little bit earlier, that the ecosystem and the elements of the ecosystem are no constraints on development because the development happens because of the rearrangement or the proper arrangement of productive forces. And also in a socialist system, of course, environmental destruction doesn't happen because people are not not motivated by capitalist greed. So maybe I'll go through this. What I want to talk about, I think I'll leave this periodization as it is, except to talk about what has happened since 1978, because it was about this time, a few years later, but referring back to this time, that Deng Xiaoping made his famous statement that 发展才是硬道理. Revolution retreated in practice. But of course, the party, in order to preserve its legitimacy, was unable to lose the Marxist teleology. So we get this weird thing called socialism with Chinese characteristics, which some people say is another name for capitalism, but it's a little more complicated than that. It's a mode of production that we have not seen elsewhere or elsewhen, anywhere in the world. But revolution had to remain in the ideology because it was the legitimate ideology of the party, which after all, as I was wrong. When I predicted in early 1989, when things were really getting going, I predicted that the Chinese Communist Party would change its name to the Chinese People's Party. You know, 中国人民党, that has a good sound to it. But that didn't happen. So they have kept, of course, especially after June 4th of that same year, they've kept their moniker as a communist party and keep at some level their legitimacy on the idea that they are promoting progress through this Marxist-Leninist teleological history of progress. At this time, of course, science went almost totally yang in two ways. It went yang in the way that leaving peasants and particularly minorities more denigrated than ever, making, in a sense, much more negative and less positive the contributions of the peasantry. When it was about class struggle, then of course the peasantry was making a big contribution. When it was more explicitly about Fajian, without Goming being mixed in, then the peasants were nothing but loho. And the minorities, of course, were gongloho and more denigrated officially and unofficially than other. But at the same time, the state became aware of environmental problems. Now, of course, they were aware of it before. There was some environmental monitoring going on in Beijing, for example, in the 70s. But they stopped thinking in the delusional way that the environment cannot be degraded by socialist development, and they began putting serious thought into environmental protection. However, there was another contradiction that came about, which was a contradiction between development and environment, which became sharper and sharper as development accelerated. If development is the only hard truth, then you could leave the environment aside and clean up later. And of course, there was an international dimension to this as well, because larger or not larger, but more powerful countries around the world were blaming China for pollution and later on for greenhouse gas emissions, and for nationalist reasons, of course, the Chinese government reacted in the other way. And so during the 1980s and the 1990s, there was a nominal nod to environmental protection. But because development was the only hard truth, the nod to environmental protection was a little bit like the nod to revolution. It was there on paper, but it was very unsuccessful. And so in a sense, there was more of the same, more rapid development and more degradation of the landscapes, of the land, of the air and water, and more and of the natural resources in general. And this led, of course, to what Václav Smil in his wonderful pioneering book in 1993 called China's Environmental Crisis. However, at some point, the regime really needed to recognize what was going on. And there were a series of wake-up calls in the 1990s and into the early 2000s. And the one that I like to concentrate on, because I think it's the most important one for this shift in thinking, was the floods that ravaged the Middle Yangtze, Middle Changjiang region in the summer of 1998. And because of this and other impetuses, and also because of more international pressure, the state moved to what we in this new book that Loretta mentioned are called eco-developmentalism, moved from being a pure developmental state to what we call an eco-developmental state, and a state where, which emphasizes that in order for development to continue, to be sustainable, and of course, 可持续发展 was a big slogan in the 2000 decades, it's going to have to pay attention to sustainability of the environment and sustainability of resource use. This doesn't mean that it puts environmental protection ahead of development, but it recognizes that in order to have development, there has to be an environmental protection. And in our new book, if I can make a short plug, there's the comparison to the other three East Asian states, to Taiwan, to Japan, and to South Korea, who made similar moves a little bit earlier than China, but similar moves from purely developmental to eco-developmental states. Unfortunately, we could not find out enough about North Korea or find anybody who knew enough about North Korea to include a case study in the book. So the final thing I want to talk about is the ideology that's gone along with the eco-developmental state. And this is, of course, the ecology that they call 生态文明 or ecological civilization. And this is a really, really remarkable thing because Marxist thinkers have in China, and of course you have to be a Marxist thinker in order to be an official thinker, they have formulated a new version of, or a new track of the Marxist-Leninist teleology of historical development. Pan Yue, who was Vice Minister of the Environment for a long time, was one of the main theorists who talked about this. He began by saying things like, Earth's resources are limited, explicitly repudiating the 人定胜天, the idea of conquest of nature, which was so important not only in Mao's but in party thinking generally. And Pan said in an important 2006 essay, environmental culture emphasizes that the Earth's resources are limited and that science cannot allow people to mistakenly think that our ability to change nature to benefit humanity is limitless. If we take 人定胜天 to its logical conclusion, it will put humanity into an existential predicament. Pan turns orthodox Marxist-Leninist material ideas on their heads by saying, and I think this is a really, really important statement, or a revealing statement. Relations, and the quote here, relations between humans and nature control relations among people. That's the opposite of orthodox Marxist approaches to the environment. Materiality becomes a different kind of material. It's the material relations between humans and other aspects of the material environment that are important, and they control the historical progression of the modes of production. Now, of course, in order to become an official or semi-official ideology, Pan had to retain the necessary connection to the Marxist-Leninist dialectical teleology, where he said, he actually formulated, along with other people, this teleological sequence that you see on your screen. Along with the modes of production, which we all know, we go from feudalism to capitalism to socialism through a series of dialectical revolutionary changes, are stages of civilization. And as feudalism corresponds to agrarian civilization, and capitalism corresponds to industrial civilization, socialism corresponds to something called ecological civilization. So this becomes a post-industrial green kind of civilization, which becomes a guiding part of the ideology of the party. And it's not just people like Pan Yue, who after all was only a vice minister of the environment, but there was an important People's Daily editorial which made this official, this idea of Shen Tai Wenming as official. And this is written under one of the famous pseudonyms that the Party Center uses to write editorials in the People's Daily and elsewhere, Ren Zhongping. The origin, I'm quoting here, the origin of ecological civilization lies in reconsideration of development, and also in raising the level of development and in superseding industrial civilization. It is through re-examining China's development from new heights of civilizational development that our party has included building an ecological civilization into the 5 united into 1 matrix of socialism with Chinese characteristics. So ideologically, not only does nature stop being the enemy, not only do people stop being the determining factors in history with no constraints from the environment, but the determining factor in the whole Marxist-Leninist teleology is relationships between people and natural environment, which, as we've seen earlier from Pan Yue, is controlled, or the relations between humans and nature control relations among people. In other words, in order to supersede industrial civilization, according to this party editorial, we have to have a new definition of development. And it's a new definition of development that includes the constraints, but also the opportunities provided by relationships between the humans and the environment as the primary relations of production. So this is really a turnabout in Marxist ideology, which comes, of course, in concert with a turn in the idea of science to a almost completely young scientific conception. And of course, at the same time, China's science has in many ways caught up with the world, whether it's a collection of truths that the Chinese scientists are discovering, or the prestige of the scientists themselves in China, or the ways in which Chinese scientists have contributed to world science. And we know that the earliest, we don't know how good it is, but we know that they're ahead of the rest of the world in the coronavirus vaccine. And this is, and in addition, they're probably ahead of the rest of the world in space exploration, if we take two different kinds of very young science. So in conclusion here, I want to read you the last paragraph of the chapter on which this talk is based. Ideas of development, revolution, and science have continued to dominate CCP environmental ideology and practice. Development has been the consistent anchor of the whole tripod, as Deng Xiaoping famously said, 发展才是引导力. From cautious imitation of Stalin through utopian fantasy and disaster, to retreat into a planned economy, to adopting much of capitalism, to dreaming of a green future, development has always been at the core. Revolution is no longer plays an explicit role in the narrative of development going forward. But because no one dares not to be Marxist in public, revolution continues to hover in the background. Even though there's little explicit use of the word, officials and theoreticians must couch development in a teleological narrative of human progress toward eventual communist harmony and plenty. Science remains the primary means to achieve development. Now, however, science no longer incorporates peasant wisdom or local knowledge, except for a few peasant radicals and ethnobiologists. Instead, a network of increasingly world-class universities and research institutes not only addresses both pure and applied problems, but also acts as a signifier of development, of the advanced state of China's urban civilization and its education system, contrasted to the continued backwardness of peasants and minorities, and of China's progress toward resuming its rightful status, as Ed Winkler so pithily put it, as the world's main country. Okay, well, thank you. I will be very happy to take questions. I want to unshare my screen here so I can see who's doing what, and we'll go from there. Loretta.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a fascinating talk. And so we now open the floor to Q&A. And if you have a question, you can type it in the box. You can type your full questions in the box, or you can just say you have a question and I will pick the question. Anyone? Okay, I'll leave people a few minutes to gather their thought and take advantages as the host to ask a few questions, if that's okay. So I have a couple, but I'll try to be concise. So we've mentioned about the combination of the CCP Mao's suspicion of the combination of the 图科学 and the yang 科学. But so would you say traditional Chinese medicine is one of the exceptions, because they do combine together, like at least in the as far as I understand. And the second question is this: I find a chart of the developmentalists, like this whole new way of understanding Chinese history, not by political events, but by the environment and the human-environment relationships. So you have this developmentalist state and the eco-developmentalist state. And if I understand correctly, it's mainly based on ideology, right? So the reason I ask this question is when you say I think it's post 2000 or 2010, that is eco-developmentalist states. So how much is that is the ideology and how much is that is, actually in practice? Because I think people who do research in environmental research in China see that it's still very polluted, there's still much room for improvement. So can you say a little bit about the practice and also like the reality of the environmental state and also the ideology, the differences between them? Thank you.
Well, okay, let me address the simpler question first about Zhongyao or Zhongyi. Yeah, I think, and of course, that's how I first met you, was you were writing about this back in 2004. But yeah, this paper or this book is really about environmental science as an example of science. And I think if we were going to go into medical science, we would find a different trajectory. But having said that, the nationalist emphasis on Chinese medicine, which was so important for Mao, has faded. Zhongyao and Zhongyi are very unprestigious because they don't, they don't get very much money. The Chinese medicine hospitals are shabby. The so-called Western medicine or allopathic hospitals, the biomedical hospitals, are big and new and shiny and with equipment. So I think there has been a kind of, although it's not denying the importance of Chinese medicine, I think it's kind of faded in the background. So there has been a tendency, but it's not been as extreme a tendency as it's been in environmental science. The other question is, of course, more general and more complex, which is practice is important. I mean, this chapter is about ideology. The other 14 chapters of the book are about practice. And if we think about the practical results that have happened, environmental science is taken very seriously in a sense of the science as what scientists do. And I've been reading all kinds of natural science articles by Chinese scientists written in broken English in international journals that are really if I wanted to look at the effects of the Three Gorges Dam on sediment in the Yangtze Delta, I could easily find 40 or 50 recent articles in scientific journals in English. If I want to look at something that happening in the 1950s, of course, I have to go into Chinese primary sources. So that kind of science is being done. The level of the environmental protection, it was a state environmental protection administration that had become a ministry of the environment. And now it's combined with other ministries into a kind of super ministry of, it's called Sengtai Huanjingbu, right? A ministry of ecology and the environment. And I honestly think that they're serious in a lot of ways. And there has been some progress. There's certainly progress in air pollution, which I've written about in one of the articles in the Greening East Asia book. There's been progress in forests. There's been a lot less progress in water pollution. There's been a lot less progress in soil contamination. But there's some progress in protected areas, national parks, biological reserves, and so forth. The problem is this middle section, the short middle section of the talk, the bureaucratic context. Because in the bureaucratic context of China, officials are promoted for starting things. They're not promoted for finishing things or for sustaining things. And so often there's a lot of show and not enough actual progress in implementing and preserving the program. And then particularly because officials change posts so soon, so often, then one of the next official has to start over again with a new program and a new slogan. But I do think the eco-developmental state is real. There has not been a huge so-called air apocalypse now since 2014. And that's real progress because there's more and more cars, and there's more and more industry. China hasn't stopped its economic growth. So I think in order to understand why it hasn't done more, one is the intractability of the problems themselves, and the other is the contradiction, as I say, in this case, not between not between development and environment and so more, but between the bureaucratic context that has to happen in and the goals of the environmental programs.
It's great. It gives us some hope because usually when we read about environmental research in China, it's about the pollution and the less optimistic side. So we have another question from Anna. Please unmute yourself.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Hi. Hi, Steven. Nice to see you here again after we only had some written communication in recent months. And hello to everyone. I'm new in this round, so let me just say one sentence. My name is Anna Ahlers. I'm currently building a research group at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, where I look at China in the global system of science. So both at the expansion of the science system within China and also its increasing role in international science. And I came across this event on Twitter by chance, and I'm super happy because this is so interesting. And I've also Googled your profiles while listening to Steven, and it seems to be a fascinating round. There was so much in this talk that I found super interesting, and I'll try to focus on just one thing. The way you described how the conceptualization of science in China moved from the domestic or the indigenous kind of understanding of science to the young science. And I find that absolutely convincing, and I would say that absolutely speaks to what inspired me to draft this new research project, this wave from the more domestic focus or an indigenous focus to the international one, and a very different understanding of science. I, however, struggle to find good sources that would allow me to corroborate what I'm observing. So for the early PRC period, we can go back to the Mao quotes, and it's all there, and it's very very tangible how the CCP and how Mao himself conceptualized science. Now I think it's at least as far as I can see, it's basically our observation. I struggle to find these clear political texts where these new ideas about science are actually spelled out. So you can read it between the lines. If you read the plans for ecological civilization, you can understand what role science is supposed to play, but these like very graspable, ideologized political quotes on the role of science today. I wonder, so do you have good suggestions for where to find that, or would you say that you base what you have just outlined also on what I would say a macro observation of things? So I'm stopping here. Thank you very much.
You know, I'm also happy to see you in person. After I just make a plug for your book, since Loretta made a plug for my book. Anna and Rune Svarverud and Mette Hansen have just published. Is it in paper yet? As I was fortunate to get a pre-publication draft, a wonderful book through the AAS on the history of air pollution in China really from imperial times to the present. It's a part of the AAS short summaries. It's called AAS Shorts, I think. No, I can't remember the Great Smog of China. That's the. I remember more the contents than the title of the book. I find a similar problem. I think that Koshue becomes something that's taken for granted. You know, this is unscientific. That just means that you're talking nonsense, or you're following a superstition, or you're not doing this the way that I think it ought to be done. And I think this comes back to again to the typology of Roberto Gonzalez. You know, and it's funny that there's so many people who've written about the philosophy of science, but it seems to me that you know, that his book, which is about Zapotec peasants in Oaxaca, really sort of sets out the different ways that science is seen, and I think that, you know, for what's being assumed in Chinese discourse today is that science is both a collection of truths that have been verified and science as what scientists do. These are the two among his 6 definitions that people, as I say, rather implicitly assume, and it's hard to find them. It's like you say, it's easy to find things about ecological civilization. You know, it's all over the place. It's in the science, it's in the technical journals, it's in the party journals, it's in the newspapers, it's in the popular press. But science it becomes something that is kind of background. That everybody assumes so much that science is progress and science is necessary, that they don't very much feel like they need to say what it is. And maybe this is deliberate, that the science is a kind of a metaphorical way of talking about progress, as opposed to mixin, superstition, or, you know, moho, backwardness, and so forth. But I appreciate your dilemma, and I'm sorry that I don't have any specific sources that I could send you to. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we should say the chat is not activated. I couldn't write anything in the chat, so I think that's why maybe we don't see any reactions there. So that's why I raised my hand, just as a.
I see. So we'll go to Gonzalo's question and look into the chat box issue. Thank you very much for letting me know.
Actually, I think Ray wanted to ask a question. You know, so if you want to ask a question, Ray, please go ahead. Yes, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, Gonzalo, thank you.
Okay.
Professor Harrell, thank you for your interesting historical framing of science from Mao's era to the post-market reform. So I'm Ray Chen. I'm a human geographer based in University of Exeter. So when you talk about progress and development, I think about you reach back with society, see modernity and progress become part of the problem, not the solution to improve the societal or environmental ruins. due to continuous progress with the values about accumulation of wealth and increasing productivity in food and resources exploitation. So Beck say this is a boomerang effect. There's more and more risk will be produced if we have a progressive development. So based on Beck's logic, science are used in China to monitor and control the flows of material, track the movement of humans and animals. To what extent using science is a way for contemporary China to repair environmental wounds? This is my first question. Secondly, in your transition model, what are the roles of non-human material such as pollution and waste and animals to shape the ecological civilization in China? Thank you.
Yeah, let me take the second one first. I think one of the very interesting roles is in sort of the popularization of environmental discourse. In other words, not so much the scientists who study what they study. You know, the scientists who study animals, and those who study ecosystems, and those who study, water quality, study water quality. But there begins to be, in the popular press and in popular discourse, ideas, and in education, particularly in the schools, ideas about environment and a relationship to the environment. And so animals, plants, trees, and so forth become the kind of a discursive background under which we start talking to children and about their responsibility, their social responsibility toward the environment and toward the earth. And one of the interesting things that has begun to happen is called a 自然学校, nature schools, which have sprung up in Beijing and in Kunming and other places. And Robert Eford, who has an article on this in our Creating East Asia book, talks about the fact that the educational system, the formal school educational system, mandates environmental education. And it gets done like every other aspect of education in China. That is to say, you learn a bunch of facts and you take a test on it, and then you're okay. And in fact, by the time you get to high school, since it doesn't play any part in the Gaokao, you don't even bother to learn the facts, and that test is a test that you don't take. But there, in the environmentalist community, which is gaining more and more adherence among the urban affluent and middle classes, the return to nature and connection with nature becomes an important goal. And things like nature schools, which educate both the children of the bourgeoisie and the parents themselves separately, this becomes an important way in which the awareness of the natural environment becomes something that people ought to have. And another aspect of this, I think, is in the organic food movement, which has taken off in so many urban areas in China. And I've had some students who are working with this, and I've done a little work in the area around Chengdu, where people are urban, middle class, upwardly mobile people are afraid of poison in their food, because farmers being ignorant, again, this discourse, farmers being ignorant, they spray too much pesticide. And there's something which is perhaps an urban legend and perhaps not, which is farmers have two fields, right? And they grow broccoli with all sorts of pesticides and chemical fertilizers, and they sell that to the market, and it looks beautiful. And then they grow broccoli using the manure from their pig in a field, and it doesn't look too good. It's got bug holes in it, but it's safe, and that's what they eat. And there's even reports of farmers who, because people are aware of this, there are farmers who purposely make insect holes in their fruits when they take it to the market, because the organically conscious consumers will only buy the fruit with insect holes because that's the one that's not full of pesticides. So, you know, I think you know, there was a big deal about 7 or 8 years ago about gutter oil. I don't know if you saw this at Digoyo, where restaurants were accused of taking oil out of the gutters and then reusing it for cooking oil, and as a Digoyo Huan Chanzo, and you know, nobody actually took oil out of the gutters, but they did reuse oil, which was not entirely sanitary. And then there were actually companies that sprang up to collect oil from restaurant waste and from slaughterhouse waste and so forth, and then resell it to restaurants at a profit. And this kind of public awareness of natural environment, of pesticides and pollutants, of national parks, and I think national park tourism has a big part to play in this. You know, Zhouzago, where I've done some research in northwestern Sichuan, to 5 million visitors a year. That's more than any national park in the U.S. And so I think that the role that these things play is, more than anything else, is in popular awareness, whether it's from the schools or from the nature schools or from all the sensationalist things in the newspaper, or for the fact that people are getting out and seeing things. And since over 60% of the population is now urban, there's a kind of a romanticist return to the land kind of ethic. And this goes against the sort of mainstream discourse of peasant ignorance. And peasants, certain peasant communities have taken advantage of this. You know, you can come out to the farm and buy organic vegetables. And you can come out to the farm and you farm a little plot, give you a little plot, and you can grow your own vegetables. And of course they'll help, because most of the Chinese people are totally clueless about how to grow a vegetable. But so I think that's where it plays the biggest role. And Ray, I'm sorry, I've gone on so long that I can't remember the first question.
So the first question is about backed risk society concept. Like when China, to what extent using science, right now it's digital science, is a way for China to repair environmental challenges. So in your view, how do you see the effectiveness of digital science to tinkering or resolve the environmental challenge?
So you mean actual results rather than discursively apparent results?
But Steve, can I just interrupt you, because we're sort of running out of time and we still have 2 more questions. And could we take that first question of Ray as a comment and take 2 more questions very briefly, and then we end this? Is that
Ray?
Okay?
Ray, send me an email, and I'll help you. I'll see if I could say more about that.
Thank you. So we still have 2 very quick questions. One from Francesca, the other one from Ichan. We'll take them together.
Thank you very much. That was a really, really thought-provoking paper. I'll have to go away and think about all kinds of things again, like how I think about technocracy and all kinds of stuff. But this is more a comment than a question. It's just so striking that ideology that you've been talking about in China, and the ways in which ideology permeates society, are definitely very Chinese. I was just thinking of the contrast with even, Taiwan, for example, where basically the government finally became more environmentally oriented because of popular grassroots protest, and similarly in Japan. So one day I would love to hear your thoughts about that. But for now, thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk.
Francesca, thank you. Let me just make a brief comment. Our book, Greening East Asia, which has just come out from University of Washington Press, addresses that question specifically about the relationship, where the turn, why the turn happened, how the turn has happened in all four countries, but when and where, of course, is country specific. And I think that the popular pressure plays a little bit more of a role in China than you are implying, although certainly not as big a role as is played in Taiwan or in Japan and Korea. Anyway, thank you for attending. There's one more, I think.
Yes.
Last question, Yichen,
yeah.
please.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Gonzalo. Thanks, Steve. I'm a PhD candidate in the University of Hong Kong, where I worked with Gonzalo, and I'm also a member of the Sci-Tech Asia. So thank you for this talk. I think it's very exciting and keep me awake at the time when I used to actually sleep. So forgive me if I'm asking this very question very vaguely, because I might be asleep. So you mentioned about the transition from Mao's time to Xi's ecological civilization, the difference in terms of the ideological pattern. But actually, after I checked some of this news and also the yearbooks provided by the government on the ecological civilization, I realized there are actually certain maybe consistencies there as well. So I saw there are some keywords that the governments were used to describe their achievements last year. For example, on this ecological civilization, terms like 美丽乡村, like beautiful countryside, and富垦, like they brag about how many farmers they brought back into to kind of make the soil into a farmland and stuff like that. And then talk about corrections, 整改, of a lot of the misdeeds that they made into the environment. So I kind of realized that there's something still is about showing off the human power. We have the power to develop and maybe pollute, but now we have also the power to correct that pollution and turn things back as if it is normal. And this reminds me of things like Anna Tsing's concept of scalability. And it's all about, they're still thinking about, we can build more trees, we can plant more trees, we could actually govern 治理 the pollutions, manage the pollutions, just like we could scale up a lot of developments as well. So I wonder how you would respond to that kind of patterns.
Okay, Steve, 1 minute. Okay, 1 minute, and then we have to put an end. We already went over time. Thank you.
I will just say very briefly, environmental people who talk about environmental philosophy talk about anthropocentric versus biocentric philosophies. And I don't think that China in any part of the discourse has ever developed a biocentric philosophy. In other words, even when someone like Panier says that the relations between man and nature control the relations between people and people, they're still, in a certain sense, putting the people at the center and just commanding them to pay attention to what they can or can't do to the environment, rather than actually saying, we are simply part of the environment, and we don't play any special part in it. So that's I think that's 1 minute.
Thank you very much. We'd like to thank you, Steve, for this wonderful talk. And I would like to also remind everyone that there's going to be another Sci-Tech Asia virtual seminar scheduled for, when is the date exactly, Loretta?
I think it's the beginning of December, and we'll look into advertising after this seminar. So stay tuned.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, and have a good night or afternoon or morning, depending where you are. Okay.